Hi, Peter Charles here of Hooked for Life Fly Fishing. And today let's do a video on wet fly, dry fly, and nymph hooks. I think for some people it could be a little bit of a tussle trying to figure them out. And thank you, Charles, for the suggestion on doing this video because, when you've tied for years, you tend to know these things off by heart and you really don't think about the fact if you're just starting tying, it can get quite complicated. So I thought I'd run through dries, wets, and nymphs to give you an idea of the types of hooks that are out there and what their characteristics are. So let's start off first that every hook has basically three characteristics. We have the gape, which is, that C shape where the point is. We have the shank of the hook, and we have the gauge of the wire of the hook. So when we say something is a size 8, what we're saying is the gape is a size 8. Now there's two other measurements that are used for the shank and for the gauge of the wire. So you'll see 2XL, which is 2 extra long, or 4XL, 6XL. You might see a streamer hook as being 6XL or even 8XL, which means, that shank is very, very long. You also get to see 2XH, which is 2 extra heavy. So if you're dealing with saltwater hooks, for example, very common, or if you're dealing with trout hooks that are meant to sink, you'll also see that as well. Now, one of the issues for us when we're buying hooks is it doesn't always say clearly on the package that it's 2XL or 2XH. Sometimes it just gives us a number and a bit of information. Sometimes they're very specific and they'll tell you a lot about what that hook is for, which is great when you got that information. But sometimes they'll just say trout hook. So it's a trout hook. What do I do with it? So let's go through that. I've got 9 hooks here. These are nymph hooks. These are nymph hooks. And these over here are dry fly hooks. So you can see right off the bat, the shank here on these hooks is relatively long compared to, say, this guy over here. And that's common with dry fly hooks. They tend to be 2 extra long hooks in order for us to have enough room to tie on all our materials. They're also light wire because we want them to float. So you've got, this is a size 16 and these two are size 10. And 10s are basically the largest you're going to usually tie a typical trout dry. 14s, 16s, and 18s are more typical. You'll notice this one. This is a 10, this is a 10, but this one's longer. This one here is a 3 extra long. That one's a 2 extra long. And that gives us a little extra room to tie material on. Now, one of the interesting things to consider about these guys here, let's say you have a size, say 14, and it's not long enough for your material, not big enough for the fly. So you say, say to yourself, okay, well, I'm just going to go out and get a size 12. Yeah, well, that'll work. But when you go to size 12, the gauge of the wire will be heavier and the gape will be bigger. So you've got a heavier hook. So your fly, pardon me, your fly will not float as well. If you went from a 2 extra long size 14 to a 3 extra long size 14, you're not adding much weight in the hook and you've got the extra length in the shank to tie in your materials. So often it's better to stay in a dry fly and just go for a longer shank than go up in size where you're going to end up with a bigger gape and a heavier wire. Because every time you go up in size, the gauge of the wire gets heavier. So if you can get away with a size 16 extra long, 3 extra long, over a size 14, 2 extra long, you're going to have a fly that will float better. So what you're looking for in a dry fly is a shank that's at least a 2 extra long, maybe a 3 extra long. You're looking for a light wire hook as well. And normally you'll see them always with these down eyes. The eye of the hook is turned down. That's typical with dry fly hooks. So even though the package may not say dry fly hook, what you're looking for is a light wire and a long shank for a dry fly. Okay, when we get into nymph, oh, look at the different sizes here and different shapes. Now we got some interesting one. This is a size 14. This is a Daiichi 1270, and it's the same as a Tiemco 200R or 300R. They're the same shape. Most people think of them as 200R or 300R. They're used to that numbering system. But a number of companies make exactly the same hook. Now, they're typified by, a bend in the shank. It's a light wire, straight eye. And you could use this as a dry fly hook as well, because this is a light wire hook. It's also useful for an emerger hook. So emergers where we want them just under the surface or at the surface. So a light wire hook works for us there. This would also be good for use as a fly that to where the nymph actually swims, especially when you want to imitate that period where the mayfly is rising to the surface. Because mayflies don't have a pupal stage. So their nymph that's living under the rocks and the nymph that swims to the surface looks the same. So when we're, say, tying a nymph that we want to use as an emerger, this is a good hook to use. So because it's a light wire. But a light wire hook doesn't sink that well. So when you're looking at nymph hooks, you're usually looking at heavier hooks to get them to sink. This one here is a size 12, and you can see it's got a little jig bend here, and that jig bend is meant to accept tungsten beads. It's a light wire hook, but it takes a tungsten bead, a slotted bead that will really, really get it down fast. And having a light wire hook means that it will actually balance well. It'll actually sit level on the end of your leader when you've got a tungsten bead on it. It's quite neat how it sits. It's almost snag proof. And the light wire penetrates well. So it's a barbless design with a long point. And it holds surprisingly well. This one is a nymph hook. And there we got the box there. Black nymph. And that's a size 12 also, but you notice these are both 12s. So the gape is the same, but look at the difference. This has got a bend in it. It's got an offset point, which means the point veers off from the direction of the shank. In theory, it holds better. The eye is slightly up, and so this is designed for a nymph that's going to be near the bottom. So with a long shank like that, I want to make a point. There are three kinds of nymphs that we get in mayflies. We get a burrowing nymph, a crawling nymph, and a swimming nymph. Burrowers and crawlers tend to be broad and short. Swimmers tend to be long and skinny. So if you're tying like an Isonychia, for example, or a blue-winged olive, those are swimming nymphs. You want a long skinny hook or long skinny fly. If you were going to tie a crawler nymph, well, the short shank hook is probably a better idea because the bodies on those are quite short and thick. So depending on what you want to do with the type of mayfly you're trying to imitate, you might go with something like this or something like this. Now, this weird one here, this is another Daiichi, it's a 770. It's a swimming nymph hook because, as I said before, Isonychias and blue-winged olives and those variety of swimming nymphs, they're often in the rocks, but they'll spend some of their time hunting. They're carnivores, and they will actually swim around, and they become more available to trout because they are free swimming. So the bend in that hook is to, mimic the way these nymphs swim in the water, and they're rocking from side to side like this as they swim. Their tails kick from side to side. So this fly, when it's in the water, will have that kind of, droop to it. Now, this is a standard wet fly hook. It's a standard shank, standard length shank, regular gape, but it's a 2 extra heavy shank, gauge I should say, 2 extra heavy gauge to get it to sink. So this is something you tie on a partridge and orange or an Adams wet fly or anything like that. If you've seen my wet fly series that I've done, they've all been tied on this hook. And the whole point of it is to get down, on its own without weight. This is a caddis hook or a sedge hook. This is a large one. Most of the time we're going to use smaller ones. I put a large one up here to make it obvious. Again, offset point, slight up eye, big bend. It imitates the caddis worm bend. Something else to keep in mind too, when you're dealing with caddis, they do have a pupal stage, and that's what the purpose of partridge and orange is all about, is that you've got a fly that imitates the pupal stage when they're going from the rocks to the surface. Unlike mayflies, which is the same insect basically, the nymph in the rocks, the nymph emerging is the same thing. in caddis, the caddis worm that lives in the rocks and the pupa that's swimming to the surface look different. So that's the reason why you've got a caddis worm on the one hand, and you've got a wet fly like a partridge in orange. On the other hand, they can be actually the same bug that you're imitating. So when you're looking at these hooks, you know, you can look at the dry fly hooks, where you've got this extra long and you've got the light wire. And then you can have a hook that's just as long, but it's designed for nymphs. And the difference is the gauge of the hook is the primary difference. Also, you get the dry fly hooks tend to be straight, and you get all sorts of different bends in the nymph hooks. So when you see something that looks like this, you know right off the bat it's going to be a sedge hook that's designed for caddis. Now, I will mention there are a couple of specialized hooks out there that are dry fly hooks. One's called a clink hammer. It looks like that, but it has a bend in it, a unique bend in it. I'm not going to get into those really super special ones, but there are some oddball dry fly hooks out there. There's one called a Swedish hook, if I remember correctly. So there's a variety of different kinds of hooks out there that you can use. And this, I believe, is very similar to the Swedish dry fly hook. I think it looks something similar to that. So there you go. If we can sum up, dry fly hooks are long shanks, light wire. Wet fly hooks tend to be short shanks, heavy wire. Nymph hooks come in a variety of different shapes and sizes and length of shank and gauge of wire. But keep in mind, when you're tying a dry fly or an emerger, you want a light wire hook because you want the thing to float near or on the surface of the water. If you've got too heavy a gauge of wire, the thing is going to sink. Go for as long a shank as you can usably make with your dry fly hooks. So I would prefer to use this in, let's say, in a size 14 than going to this in a size 12, just so I need that extra length for the material for the size of the fly. So you're trying to get as light a wire hook as you possibly can for a dry fly. And the same is true for emergers. If I was using this hook, for example, for an emerger, you know, it's a light wire hook, same thing. It's a long shank, light wire, small gape. It's going to float rather well, and it'd be a good emerger hook. I could add lead to any one of these, or bead to any one of these, and really get it down. So don't forget, we can always add weight. So that's basically the difference. You know, nymph hooks tend to be heavy gauge. Dry fly hooks are light gauge. Dry fly hooks tend to be long. Nymph hooks can be all over the map. And unfortunately, when you're picking up these packages, they don't always tell you what it's for. You've sort of got to do a little bit of calculation sometimes and look, oh, well, that's a long shank. They don't say anything about it being heavy, so that must be a dry fly hook. Sometimes it's a process of elimination. I wish they would label them better and say dry fly, wet fly, nymph. Some do, some don't. I mean, here's the same manufacturer of a hook. Specific that says nymph on the one on the left, one on the right doesn't say if it's for dries, it just says trout. And I guess the reason why they do that is because you could use it for nymphs too if you wanted to. There's no reason why you couldn't use that type of hook for a nymph. You could. I mean, if that's all you had, go for it. If you're worrying about getting it down, put a couple of wraps of lead on the thing or a bead. It'll get down. So there you go. Those are the differences on the hooks. As I say, I wish some of the boxes were better labeled, make it easier, but they're not always. Just keep those points in mind about the gauge, the gape, and the length of the shank. Cheers.